Thank you, Mr. Brooke, and I will try not to fill up the long space that you described that's available from now until the wind-ups begin. Can I first of all congratulate my honourable friend for East Hampshire, who has raised an issue that I've seen debated in this chamber, I think, 4 or 5 times in the last 5 years or so, demonstrating something which is also demonstrated by the number of honourable friends who are seeking to speak in the debate today, namely what an extremely important issue it is. It affects communities across the whole of England. The people who are here today are probably a small group of those honourable members from all sides of the House who have significant worries about this. Now, the first thing I'd say is that with the exception of my honourable friend, the member for Folkestone, I beg his pardon, for Folkestone, who raised a particularly interesting topic to do with trespass, which, as far as I can recall, was actually dealt with quite well by the last act passed by the last Conservative government, the Trespass Act 1997, which did take some efforts towards putting that particular point right. No doubt it needs improving, but nonetheless, the basic machinery is there. But all of the other people who have spoken in the debate so far have addressed an exactly identical problem, which is people of one sort or another, and I'll come back to who those people are, illegally occupying a vacant site, which they own nearly always a bank holiday Monday, within a few days inserting hard-standing, of course, I've got lots of time.
The interesting point about trespass is that for public authority land, there is not the criminal trespass law that we can rely on. And what we're looking for our new coalition government to bring through from our manifesto is a new intentional criminal trespass law that allows us, for public authority land, to have the same rights as private authority land. And that will be a major, major development. And I thank the honourable gentleman for allowing me to...
The honourable for South Derbyshire. Makes a similar point to the Honourable Gentleman from Folkestone. Both of them are quite right, although, of course, they're not absolutely central to the topic of the debate today, which is the illegal occupation of land owned by gypsies and travellers and others. Now, the pattern, as I say, is a similar one. It's been described by many people during the debate today, namely, people move onto land on often a bank holiday weekend before anybody knows what's happening. Hard standing has gone down, toilet blocks have been erected, gardens have been put up. Very often, bungalows, not caravans we're talking about here, very often little bungalows are established within a very short time, as I've seen in my own constituency in Minety, in Calcutta Park near Cricklade, and a variety of other places. I think I've got 8 or 10, I think, altogether illegal gypsy encampments in my own constituency. Within a very short space of time, there is something which looks for all the world exactly like a village has been established. There are wheelie bins at the end of the drive. Electricity has been laid on. These people have established something which would not be allowed, no one else would be allowed to do. I won't bore the House by repeating what's been very eloquently described by a number of my honourable friends, but I would like just to address, if I may, the particular reason why this is allowed to occur. And that, I think, was referred to by the Honourable Lady, I think for South Derbyshire it was, who referred to the noble Lord, Lord Prescott, and what a noble lord he is, and the way in which he brought in, if I remember rightly, Planning Circular 01/2006, which, it will be recalled by the House, was a planning circular which said to planning inspectors that where local authorities are not able to demonstrate that there is adequate provision for gypsies and travellers elsewhere in the area, that there should be a presumption in favour of illegal gypsy and travel encampments. Now, that has meant, and I've had several such cases in my own constituency, that where the planning inspector sits on an appeal, he is required by the law to say that unless the local authority can demonstrate there is adequate provision elsewhere, that he must give permission to the gypsies and travellers for that illegal encampment. He has no other option. I don't blame the inspectors. He's required by that single planning note to do just that. Now, there are several problems with that, quite leaving aside the question of the two-tier planning system which that implies, and I'll come back to that perhaps in a second. There are a number of specific problems associated with that circular. The first is that it doesn't stipulate who are gypsies and travellers, and I mentioned I'd come back to that in a moment. There is no distinction made under the law between hippies, between New Age travellers, between people who are homeless, between traditional Romanis, such as many of them I have in my own constituency in Wiltshire, between Irish travellers, between Roma, between people coming in from France, and one saw the French government expelling a large number of Roma recently. There's nothing to prevent those people coming here and declaring themselves to be gypsies and travellers. There's no definition under the law which distinguishes amongst those people. So when the gypsy and traveller assessments were made, as they were made, I think one of the other speakers mentioned this a moment ago, under the Regional Spatial Strategy, that defunct organisation, I'm glad it is, that defunct document. When those assessments were made, local authorities were required to assess how many travellers there were in the area and what sort of provision there was for them. Now, first of all, there's no way of doing that. These people, by definition, are travellers. Are we talking about the travellers resident in the county of Wiltshire, or are we talking about the travellers resident in the southwest of England, or in the west of England, or in Wessex, or in England, or what? There is no actually scientific way of assessing who these people are because, by definition, they don't live in one place. A very large number of the travellers in my own constituency come from Ireland. They are Irish. There are others who come from the continent of Europe. An interesting sideline, incidentally, is the Irish and the Romanese won't live on the same site. So the site at Thingley Junction in my constituency, which has vacancies, is occupied by the Irish travellers. The Romanese, perfectly reasonably, say they don't want to go there because they don't like each other. I'm just not certain that society has a duty to provide for people that don't happen to like each other. And if somebody came into my constituent surgery and said, I want a council house, but I'm not going to go and live in that particular council estate there because they're all Irish people and I don't want to go and live with the Irish, I would say, well, I'm extremely sorry about that, madam, but you're jolly well going to have to put up with it. Like the same applies here. So we don't know who these people are. They are, by definition, travellers. The population of the United Kingdom is increasing exponentially. I'll come back to that in 1 second, over the last 30 or 40 years. And therefore, to say to a local authority, do you have enough provision for these people, is an impossible question. They cannot, by definition, say, yes, we do. As it happens, of course.
I'm not sure if my honourable friend has found a similar situation in Wiltshire as we have in South Staffordshire, but we found there's a number of gypsy and travellers have successfully applied for planning permission, got established sites, and then in the local newspaper I seem to have noticed those sites being commercially marketed to people who aren't gypsies and travellers, and they're exploiting the law for personal profit.
I noticed that particular episode was mentioned, I think, in the newspapers recently. That hasn't been my experience. All those illegally occupied sites in my own constituency, and I think throughout the West Country, have then been fully occupied by gypsies and travellers. I haven't seen any of them being sold on, but I suppose there's no reason why they shouldn't be, although whether or not a local authority would give planning permission to a settled person to take over a gypsy encampment afterwards, I have my doubts, and I certainly recommend they shouldn't do. But the numbers are extremely interesting. I remember when I was Special Advisor to the Secretary of State for the Environment, we had the great joy of repealing the Gypsy and Traveller Encampment Act. This was the act which required local authorities to make provision for gypsies and travellers in their counties. And the reason we did that was because this act had been passed by the Labour government in 1966, when, from memory, there were 3,500 illegally parked caravans in England. 3,500 illegally parked caravans. By the time we came to repeal the Act in 1996, there were 6,000 illegally parked caravans, so the illegals had more or less doubled. That was in addition to the 7,000 pitches which local authorities had by then provided. So local authorities provided twice as many as they were required to do under the Act. In addition to that, there were further 6,000 illegally parked. That total of 13,000 caravans in England is now 18,355 caravans in a recent survey, gone from 3,500 to 18,500 in as many years.
I'm most grateful to my honourable friend. I think he's touching on a very, very important point, which is perhaps illustrated by road building, where you put an extra lane on a motorway and it doesn't solve the problem, it just brings in another lane's worth of traffic.
I think my honourable friend is exactly right. It's what I would describe as a kind of Parkinson's law of gypsy caravans. No matter how many sites you provide for them, more appear. And that comes back to the original question of the definition of what these people are. Who are gypsies? What are Romanese? But what definition do we have under the law? The answer is none at all. And the more sites you provide, the more people appear in order to fill them. I therefore don't subscribe at all to the underlying principle behind planning guidance note 01/2006 that somehow or other a local authority must demonstrate that they have made adequate provision. It is not possible for a local authority to demonstrate that they have made adequate provision. No matter how many sites they provided, it would be perfectly possible for the gypsy and traveller community to come along and say there aren't enough of them. Indeed, I think that there seems to be a kind of moth to the flame sort of attraction. The more sites you do provide in your county, the more gypsies and travellers appear to try and fill them. And Wiltshire, and indeed the West Country as a whole, seems to be a bit of a hot spot for that. Now, this seems to me to be completely wrong and something which the current government has indicated intention to address. I think we have to address it by abolishing the noble Lord, Lord Prescott, as I like to call him's planning guidance note, by abolishing the regional spatial strategy, and by saying to local authorities precisely what they say to local authorities with regard to homeless people from the settled community. The rule with regard to the settled community is if you need a council house, you go and see your local authority or your MP too often, or the housing association. In order to get a house, you have to demonstrate need a certain prioritised way, and you have to demonstrate a local connection. And if you came into my constituency surgery and said, hello, I come from Inverness, and I'm homeless, and I want you to get in touch with the local authority and get me a council house, I'd say, I'm awfully sorry. You must go back to Inverness and get your council house in Inverness. You aren't going to get one in Wiltshire because we demand a local connection here in Wiltshire. Now, I think precisely the same applies to the gypsy community. These are very, very nice people. Some of them are very close friends of mine. And those who live in Wiltshire have a right to have proper gypsy encampments in Wiltshire. But those who come into Wiltshire from elsewhere have no right whatsoever to demand that the people of Wiltshire should pay for sites for them to be accommodated. I just think that exactly the same rules should apply to them as it applies to anybody else, both with regard to planning and with regard to housing. I have a particularly good example of this in my own constituency, which I think is an outrage, but it does just highlight precisely what's gone wrong with our planning process in this respect. A very nice lady came to see me, and she had an organic farm in the village of Box in my constituency, and she had a caravan in which she lived in the centre of the organic farm, about 15 acres from memory it was. Now, rather bizarrely, the local authority looked at the profitability of the organic farm and concluded it wasn't profitable. It wasn't a going concern. She couldn't make it a going concern. Had it been profitable, she'd have been allowed to carry on living in the caravan. That in itself is bizarre. So she was required to leave the caravan, although incidentally, she was allowed to leave it for chickens. The caravan could remain where it was just so long as she didn't live in it. Fine, so far. Next door, just down the road, there is an entirely vacant field, which was bought at a very high price by a group of travellers. They moved on to the site. They are in precisely the same position as the non-traveller organic farmer. They went to appeal. They said, we are gypsies, and the local authority, or rather the inspector, was required by law to give them permission to remain in the field adjacent to the one where the person from the settled community had been removed. Now, that seems to me to be absolutely disgraceful. There's no reason at all why any particular group in our society, white, black, green, gay, straight, Chinese, anything you like, why should they be given different planning rules to anybody else? It seems to me it should be one law for one and one law for all.
Gentlemen, for giving way. I'm curious as to the example he raises and the more general implication from it. He has quite rightly said that there is no formal legal mechanism for assessing whether somebody is a gypsy or a traveller, and yet local authorities regularly do so. Does he have any experience of how local authorities make this decision? And perhaps later the Minister might elucidate upon this matter and tell us how local authorities can make a better job of assessing who is or is not qualified under the Human Rights Act and other legislation.
I'm afraid my honourable friend and I will simply not agree on this issue. I take the view that it's not up to local authorities to decide who is a gypsy, who's a Romany, who's an Irish traveller, who's a dropout, who's a hippie, or who's a settled person. Every single human being of every kind, whatever their colour, race, background or class might be, should be treated identically by the local authority, and the local authority does not need any kind of guidelines as to what to do with it. Same applies with regard to the Human Rights Act, an act with which some of us in this room have some reservations. I don't think, actually, that the Human Rights Act ought to come into the consideration as to whether or not land should be given set aside for travellers or for anybody else. Human Rights Act should be about human rights. Planning is what we're talking about here, and I just don't think that travellers or anybody else should be given preference over the settled community merely because they are travellers. What a perfect definition of racism that is. To say we as a local authority are required to do something for you, not because you're a good man, not because you're a bad man, but because you claim to be some kind of Romany, Irish, Roma, Gypsy, who knows what. You claim you are that, and therefore I've got to do something for you that I won't do for you. That seems to me to be unacceptable in 21st century Britain. I very much hope that the new Secretary of State will do away with it. Of course.
I'm very grateful to the Honourable Member for giving way, and I apologise to the Honourable Member for East Hampshire for having missed the opening speeches in this debate. I was detained on other business. I just simply wish to intervene on the very eloquent speech given by the Honourable Member for North Wiltshire, to simply ask him whether, as I understand it, he is denying the existence of travelling people as a community within the UK. And in those circumstances, presumably he therefore would disagree with the government's approach, which I believe is retained, which is that local authorities should, wherever possible, find sufficient official sites provided by the local authority to meet the needs of that travelling community. If that were done, then we wouldn't be debating the issue of illegal encampments, because there should be sufficient pitches available for those in need.
I'm most grateful to the Honourable Gentleman with whom I've crossed swords for many, many years and many, many subjects for his intervention. He was late for the debate. I'm not sure, perhaps he missed my speech as well. Perhaps he didn't. I most certainly was not denying the existence of the travelling community. Quite the opposite. I said at the beginning that I felt strongly that the travelling community had perfect rights to be travellers. Good luck to them. That's fine. It's not my way of life. I can't stand camping at all. But if they want to be travellers, absolutely fine. And of course, it's right that local authorities should make suitable provision for the travelling community as they do for the settled community. And of course, it's right that the local authorities should make provision for the local traveller community. But I saw no reason at all to do so for the wider travelling community. So I'm most certainly not denying their existence, nor am I denying the state's responsibility to make proper provision for them. Those are both absolutely right. But it's a question of the means by which that occurs is what we're discussing, not whether or not it ought to happen. So I very much welcome the stricter stance that the new incoming Secretary of State for DCLG is taking on these matters. I very much welcome the fact that he's has abolished the RSS, which is really the document that lies behind much of this. I very much hope that part of that will be to do away with the Gypsy and Traveller assessments, which were flawed, to say the least, whether they were done by whichever college it was that was mentioned earlier on, by Salford Technical College, or by anybody else. I call for him to stipulate that the planning status of gypsies and travellers should be precisely identical to the planning status of everybody else, and indeed their rights in every other respect should be identical to everyone else. I call on him to bring in stronger enforcement powers so that when these outrages occur, local authorities have got the power to go onto these sites and to deal with these people in a way that they would do if it were anybody else. And I very much welcome the fact that he has laid down the stipulation in his general approach to planning that the people who will decide whether or not these things occur, whether it be with regard to gypsies or with regard to houses, should be local councillors who are answerable to local people. It is they, the local councils, who are the people who must make up their minds about the way in which these things happen. It should not be down to the noble Lord Prescott, nor his successors in the Department of CLG.